Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. Today, I'm bringing you quite possibly one of my favorite interviews of all time on Podcast Envy. Why? Because it didn't really feel like an interview at all. It felt like catching up with an old friend. You know, when it just clicks back in after all these years like no time has passed whatsoever. Except today's guest, Candice Wu from the Embody Podcast, and I have never met. We've never even had a real-time conversation. The magic of podcasting. And we talk about that in this episode. Actually, there isn't much we don't talk about, from how scary it can be to do your interviews when you're first starting your podcast, to being called in to look at who we have on our shows in terms of uplifting diverse and marginalized voices, to the trauma of all that we're experiencing so far in the year 2020, and how we as podcasters have the opportunity to be responsive to that. In fact, Candice and I connected online to record this conversation in the midst of the protests and riots that broke out in the U.S. in response to the murder of George Floyd by police. It was so fresh in that moment that I even reached out to her that day to see if we should still record. And ultimately, we decided to go ahead and talk about it and to include some thought into what it means to have the responsibility of having a microphone and having a platform and people who listen to us in times like these. You do listen to me, don't you? And of course, because Candice is more than just a podcaster, she uses her podcast as a platform to help share some of the healing meditations and what she calls experientials, modalities, resources, services to support people in just such a traumatic, stressful time as these. She wanted to make sure that I mention 2 different resources that she would love to share with you. First of all, we'll talk about the different types of episodes that Candice produces on the Embody Podcast, and you can certainly look there. However, she has also made a super handy, easy way to grab just those experiential meditations. Aside from personal journal style episodes and interviews, you can find that list of online meditations at CandiceWu.com/meditations. Candice's name is CandiceWu.com/meditations. And also an online workshop that you can take at your leisure called Touch in a Time of Physical Distancing, Supportive Self-Touch. The link for that online workshop is at CandiceWu.com/touch. And of course, you know I will be linking to both of those in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/podenvy063, linked conveniently in the episode description in your app. Side note, Candice was joining me from a homemade podcast blanket fort in Mexico. Really, I should have taken a screenshot. It looked amazing and it sounded super lovely. But for some unknown reason, we had a software or connection glitch that made almost the entire interview out of sync during the recording. Don't worry, you don't have to skip this episode. You cannot tell. Yay for meticulous editing by yours truly. But for most of the conversation, I could see visually that Candice would speak and then she would stop talking, but her audio was still streaming into my headphones on a delay. So she'd be sitting there blinking at me while I finished listening to her previous thought before responding. It was quite hilarious, and we do reference it at one point late in the interview, so be sure to listen for that little reference in the conversation about how podcasting is not live radio. Thank God. After listening to this episode, you are going to be so relaxed and at ease from the sound of Candice's voice. And simultaneously, I imagine your curiosity will be piqued about her show. I will link to the Embody Podcast and some ways to connect with Candice in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/podenvy063. Linked in the episode description in your podcast app. Are you ready? Here we go. Candice Wu, thank you so much for joining me for Podcast Envy. It's so fun to finally meet you.
Same. Likewise. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be on the show. Excited to talk to you about all things podcast.
Yeah, and tell us where you are coming from right now.
I am near Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, and I'm going to be here for a couple more days. We're in the middle of coronavirus, I think, still, but I'm going to be traveling on Saturday to California.
So I originally discovered you through Sarah Bueno. Sarah Bueno, my client who has conversations with a wounded healer, and she interviewed you quite some time ago now, I think.
It was like in the early times. She and I both
Yeah.
started a podcast near the same time. Maybe she started hers first. I don't know. It doesn't matter, but it was like about the same time. And we both got to interview on each other's shows, and that was really fun.
And then I started listening to your show, and I have to make a confession to you. So I categorize my shows that I listen to. I wish that there was a way for me to do this within an app, actually. If there are any app developers who happen to listen to Podcast Envy, take note. I wish that there was a way for me to categorize shows that I listen to, like morning time shows, afternoon time shows, and evening time shows.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Yes. There's a mood. There's a different vibe for each time. Gosh, that would be great.
Yeah. And so you're in the evening time shows for me. The Embody Podcast is an evening time show. And laying in bed, relaxing, falling asleep.
Oh.
So, yeah, I don't know if that's weird to think of someone falling asleep to the sound of your voice or not.
Honestly, I hear it all the time. And I just take it as a compliment. And some people cannot sleep. And just hearing someone's voice that, they feel maybe safe with or it's calming, that can make a big difference in someone's life. So I get that all the time. So I must be one of your, sleepy time podcasts.
Exactly. There have been times where I wake up the next morning and I see your episode in my history and I'm like, wait, I didn't actually hear that. I was asleep.
Be careful, Andrea. I'm going to put some subliminal messages in there. You won't even know what got you.
Seriously. I trust you. I trust you that
gosh.
they will be for my benefit and not for the downfall of humanity.
Yes, I hope I can deliver on that. One of my teachers in my yoga training would say, don't worry if you fall asleep, because people would fall asleep all the time. This stuff we were working on was intense and deep, and it was a long day. And he'd say, don't worry, if you fall asleep, you'll get it anyway. And there is something just that I like to bring to my podcast, very much so, is an energetic quality to what I'm sharing. So sometimes it's really not even necessary to listen to the words. I try to come with the intention of what vibration I want to share with people. So if you're sleeping, you'll still get it.
I know. My subconscious mind is so much stronger than my conscious mind at this point.
I think all of ours are, which is probably what's, living itself out in the world right now.
Yeah, let's actually provide a little bit of context. So, talking with podcasters about how they are using their show, their platform for supporting their community during the time of COVID. And now there's another layer that is happening with the George Floyd murder and everything that's happening around the protests against racism and police violence, the riots that are happening in various places, including my city of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And for a moment, COVID sort of disappeared, even though it didn't really disappear.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I don't know about you, but I feel a great responsibility as a podcaster. And by no means do I have an enormous platform or do I consider myself to be a very publicly watched influencer or anything like that. But with the platform that I have and somebody who is creating content and is using a microphone to say things, which, as you said, hopefully influence people and hopefully, creates a certain energetic vibration, I feel an enormous responsibility to show up in some way in both of these crises. For you, what are you thinking, feeling, experiencing as a podcaster and as somebody who has a voice and a platform that you are sharing publicly in these times?
That has been the question of the last few months for me. It's interesting because there is a sense of, I'm not sure if I would say responsibility for me in the way that typically people feel that word or think of that word, but I've been thinking of responsibility as response ability, that I have the ability to respond and what do I want to do with that? And so there's been that feeling like I can respond to this. Do people want to hear from me? Do I want to share? And what can I offer right now that feels aligned with me and my creativity, as well as are relevant to what people may be going through, desiring, or wanting to open up for themselves? So, especially since my podcast is about healing and embodiment and being in alignment with yourself, loving yourself, it is really paramount that I do that for my podcast. So, I'm not always responding directly in a very close way to current events, but the things that I like to offer, it's my hope that they can apply across the board to all people that are desiring that kind of loving for themselves. And that means whether you're Black, white, Chinese, Latino, whoever you are, and wherever you are in the world, that it can bring you closer to yourself. So things like self forgiveness or looking at what you're feeling and feeling that in your body, these are really basic things that I just keep coming back to for myself. So I bring them back up on the podcast. And that can relate to what's going on with COVID-19 and staying at home and what feelings are coming up, as well as what's happening with the protests and racism, anti-racism, and all the Black people that have died over the years, all the people in the world. I see such a similar echo. Similar may not be the right word, but there's an echo of police brutality and human rights that I was really paying close attention to in Hong Kong. And that's still up for me. So it feels really hard to feel responsible in that way to touch on every single current event. So I try to just bring this sort of foundational support for anything and then draw a bridge between what might be really going on that's especially intense, which is what I'm seeing right now.
Yes. I spend a lot of time, probably more than I should, in online forums for podcasters. And there is a lot of like push pull happening right now in terms of depending upon your identity, depending upon both how you self identify and then also the identity that you were born with, that there is a lot of uncertainty with how to proceed
Absolutely.
and how to proceed in a way that is helpful, that is compassionate, that is useful, that is not the thing that I've been working on a lot, which is very challenging, is this idea of speaking from authentic experience, not trying to talk about things I don't know or are outside of my experience, and yet also not trying to center myself.
Yeah. I I don't know the answer. I love how you phrased that. You try to speak from an authentic place that is your experience. And one of the things that I really enjoy doing is just that, because it actually helps people understand the information that I'm sharing and where it's coming from. I was in grad school for clinical psychology for a short time of my life, and in that time I was looking at all sorts of research because I was like preparing to write some dissertation that I ended up not doing. But I was looking at quantitative studies and qualitative studies. And then in the qualitative study world, which is like not based on people as numbers, it's like, what is the quality of your experience? What was that like for you? And a lot of times it's more like interview style. In that world, it opened up to like indigenous research. And what I saw there was something that really helped me as a podcaster is that the indigenous studies that I read that I enjoyed spoke to who they were, their identity, what they're aware of in themselves, what their experiences are. And that was this foundation for the research they were offering or the sharing they were offering. That really resonated with me because when I look out across all the information in podcasts and blog posts, social media, I do see a lot of people that are sharing things that I don't think that they're doing themselves, or maybe they don't know a different experience and they're kind of saying this is across the board, this is how it should be done, or this is how you do it. And I have an experience that's the opposite. So I'm just a little afraid, actually, in a good way, that if I say this is how you do it, then it won't apply to some people and it will exclude people. And it's particularly important for me to just keep it open so that it is accessible to all people.
Yeah. Going back to like the beginning of your show, pre-Embody Podcast, and once Embody Podcast launched, what was your original intention for creating the show? Where did that idea come from? And your purpose, do you think that it has stayed very consistent or do you feel that it has shifted over time?
That's a great question. Originally, someone brought it up to me as a way to market, like share my work. So both market and share my work. And I was a bit uncomfortable with that idea. Like, this is a platform just to market my work. That's not really what I wanted to do. And then the sharing. Okay, I felt like, yes, I had a lot to share, but was that why I was going to create a podcast? And what I found for myself was that it was really important for my own evolution and my own growth, my own ability to use my voice, to use podcasting as this way to learn how to express myself better and to challenge myself to be in alignment with myself, be who I am, and express what I want to say and what I would like to share. And I felt that I don't know where this will go, but if I keep doing this in alignment with what brings me joy and what's fun for me, then I will have fun doing it. And wherever it goes, it goes. And honestly, it actually has stayed very true to that. There have been other business projects maybe that I've tried to come with that intention of just doing this for joy in this moment because I want to, rather than it being for the outcome of growth or for the outcome of more business or clients or whatever. And I haven't been so clear, like connected with that. And I have seen that play out. And yet with a podcast, I feel that for the most part, I have stayed in line with that. And that's made the process just way more fun. And I believe that's what makes it have its own resonance. The resonance it does have with people that do want to hear from me is that there isn't too much of an underlying ulterior motive. Yes, I do share and promote my work on there, but I stay with the joy factor. Is this bringing me joy to talk about this, to do this? What I found recently was I was doing guest podcasts. And as I arrived to Mexico, I felt like it was weighing really heavy on me. And I was pushing myself to do them. So that was my cue. This isn't right now. Just change your format. You don't have to do this, even though you decided to do it every other week. You can change it. It's your creation. So I just decided I was on hiatus. And I'm not sure if you heard this piece, but there was a time in the last couple of months where I was like, the Embody Podcast is having an identity crisis. I don't know where it's going. It doesn't know where it's going. I may be doing rerun episodes, and then I never did. Well, I did like like two, and I thought I would be doing a bunch just to have a break and to reconfigure and recalibrate. And that's when COVID-19 busted out.
Yeah. And speaking of interviews versus the things that are bringing you joy, you have some different types of episode styles.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest benefits of podcasting is that personal development, is that self-reflection, is that learning how to formulate your thoughts and how to express them and how to create if you wanted to put it in business speak or in marketing speak, like creating your personal brand, but it's like a process of self-discovery of what that actually is. It's not like, oh, here's this fully formulated personal brand and now I will put it into a show. It's like the show sort of creates that and it evolves. And it's a huge benefit to have that opportunity for yourself. But nobody wants to pay me hundreds of dollars to create a show that's going to bring them personal development. They want me to help them create a show that's going to market their business. It's like I have to keep that personal development thing like a little secret in my back pocket. And then later my client will say, I
Mm.
never expected this to happen. I'm like, yeah, I knew it was going to happen all along.
It's like you just have to arrive there when you do. If you're looking at, this target and someone says, "Well, this is what it's about." It's sometimes hard to shift or take that in, but yeah, I hear you.
And I think for yours too, what I wanted to say is that because you're sticking to what's bringing you joy and what's interesting you, it becomes apparent because I find that your podcast is so intimate, both in terms of what we spoke about earlier with the actual energetics of the space and the quality of your voice and the way that it sounds and the way that it feels, but also you share very deeply personal, intimate things that not everyone has a comfort with that level of self-disclosure. I find it really compelling and helps me to feel like, this is the first time that we're actually meeting and talking face to face via, technology. But I feel like, I've developed a relationship with you and that I know you very well in some ways just from listening to your show.
Thank you so much. It means a lot to hear that. And I do feel that I'm very vulnerable in my shows, and I want to stay really grounded in what's really happening for me. So, as you mentioned, talking about some of the segments or different formats, that vulnerability really connects to that. So, what I've found is that that is what's interesting for people to hear, and it's actually where my growth is. And on a sidebar, I've had a handful, literally a handful of astrologers over the years tell me that my personal growth, public, is your path. And it's also what will help others grow or support others, that just you being you. And I don't know that it's not a requirement for people, right, to be vulnerable out there in the world. But I do believe that you being you is what also brings everyone, the freedom to be themselves. So that's been really interesting for me to hear and encouraging. And the response I get when I am most vulnerable to me, right, like my own measure of vulnerability, when I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, am I really going to share this? Like, am I going to talk about the UTI that I had? Am I really going to talk about, this episode that just published today, the day we're recording it, June 3rd, 2020, about racism in terms of my own discoveries of where I've held beliefs of other people that have hurt them, that relate to those beliefs related to race or some difference. And I felt that question come up, Andrea, that you said, how do I share in this time and space from my own authentic experience without centering my voice if it's a time where maybe you want to center someone else's voice? And in this case, Black lives, Black people. And I thought, well, for me personally, this is a very specific response to that, is that in this time, I did share about pieces of my own projection and possible acts of, you could call it racism, or, it wasn't like it was violent, but these unknown parts of myself that I did discover later were hurting people. So me sharing that does feel like, on one hand, it does center my voice in terms of this was my experience, but I wanted to share it intentionally because that's what I believe actually is going to support a shift in the world and in ourselves, because it comes from ourselves, where we can look at our own, where we're holding something that projects itself out into the world.
Podcast Angel time. Did you know that the Podcast Angel segment is not your cue to skip forward 3 times on your app? No, don't do it. It is a golden opportunity for you to find out about a product or service or opportunity to help your podcast and you as a podcaster flourish. In Chicago right now, it's summer, and I know July can feel traditionally like a time of colossal social distraction. But since that's not happening this July, I invite you to spend at least some of that time online with me. July 9th, 2020, I'm offering my popular Launch Your Podcast class to help you finally take the steps you need to craft a show that you and your audience will love and get your voice out into the world. If you're one of the first 15 to sign up, your ticket is free. And if you want to go even deeper, or perhaps you've already launched your show, let's talk about success. Do you wonder whether your show is working as well for you as it could be? Are you stuck in the comparison trap looking at download numbers? Or if not the comparison trap, perhaps it's the episode production hamster wheel. Well, let's put a stop to that. July 14th, I'm offering the first ever Podcast Envy office hours with your podcast boss, that's me. You get access to my brain for a full hour plus Q&A. And if you sign up now, you can apply to have your show be featured as a case study, meaning that we will take the time to design a success plan just for you. Details and links for both Launch Your Podcast and office hours are in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimpostor.com/PodEnvy063. Remember, you can totally make your show on your own, but you don't have to podcast alone.
So I kind of sidetracked here, but just to answer your previous question and then connecting with this vulnerability piece, it's actually really paramount to the original intention of the podcast, is that this is a place I'm going to share vulnerably in ways maybe that I haven't heard out there and in ways that I haven't done myself. And I don't like to just be uplifting, and I'm not good at it. Some people are good at it and they just can do it. But I don't like to just be uplifting or positive just for the sake of doing that. I want to just show up with whatever's there. And so there's the vulnerability piece where I share pieces of my life, pieces of my healing process, honest experiences of humanity, like being human. I usually call those the Alive Now episodes, especially where it's like really present, alive now. And then there are episodes of topics. And sometimes, often, I do share personal experiences in that too. It just may not be as uber present to the now, but some experiences tied in with a topic such as how to develop your intuition or energetic boundaries or ancestral trauma. And I'll talk about how this can be relevant to the healing process or what you might look at in yourself if that topic interests you, if you're drawn to it. And then a third format of the podcast is the experientials and meditations, which I really like, which is actually part of the whole reason for the podcast. I was like, I just want to share free stuff that people can access so they can do it in the practice or the safety of their own home, the quiet of their own home, if they don't want to reach out to a practitioner, or if they're my client or someone else's client and they just want to do that practice where they feel loving kindness in their bodies. And this is just a resource to direct them to. So that's the third segment. And then the fourth segment, as I mentioned earlier, was the guest podcast, which at this point is kind of taken a hold. And the guests also have brought, some of them have offered their own meditation, guided experientials, or some sort of process that gives people a taste of their work.
I was thinking about, the content of some of your episodes. When somebody asks me, this is, for the last 2 months, maybe we're going on 3 months now, that when somebody asks me, how are you? I feel like I'm generally okay physically, but I cannot regulate my nervous system right now. It just feels like I'm getting hit from all angles, even though I seemingly am safe and healthy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a yoga practice. I have a meditation practice. I have tools. I have essential oils. I have healthy food. I have crystals. I have friends who practice different types of healing modalities and therapy and Reiki and everything. And I still feel like my nervous system is like,
Oh,
for the
yeah.
love of God, can I get a break?
Yeah. It's being human. There's so many layers. And I want to just, in a big way, normalize that because there are so many layers of where we can be triggered that we know about and that we don't know about. And it's tough being human. From where I'm standing, in my experience of my own self, sometimes stuff flares up unknowingly and it's related to my ancestry and something they've experienced. Sometimes it's part of my younger experience that didn't get complete or integrated. So I hear you. We're going through so much to upgrade and integrate in our nervous systems and our body so that we can handle what's coming or what's next. I feel like for me, it's been a big training in handling the unknown and getting comfortable.
Have you gotten any feedback? I'm curious from your listeners. I know sometimes with podcasting, it can feel very one way because we're creating the content and sending it out. It's not like doing a Zoom call or even a Facebook Live or anything like that, where we don't always have an immediate feedback loop in terms of who is receiving what we're sending out, how they're receiving it, how they're responding to it. I'm curious if you've gotten any direct feedback from your listeners, from your audience, from your community about any of the content that you've been putting out recently, or about how it has been helpful or useful for them through these times.
I actually have. And I believe for me, that's part of the vulnerability that I bring to it because it does seem to open up other people's vulnerability towards me in return. And it's really beautiful. I treasure those emails that I get, or usually they come in the form of emails. Sometimes a little message on Instagram or something like that, but they're usually private rather than receiving those comments below on IG or YouTube or something, because I post my podcast to YouTube as well. It's usually in a private message. And I have gotten frequently, I fall asleep to your podcast. And and that makes me chuckle. And I have gotten stories of, wow, when you told this story, it reminded me of this experience I had. And sometimes people are telling me, I didn't realize that that was affecting me so much, or this is giving me a real chance to express this to somebody. Thank you so much for receiving it. That really touched my life. And sometimes I listen to that experiential all the time and I need it. I need it. It's exactly what I need. You're speaking to me. And once in a while, I get requests, which I like. I really like getting requests because it gives me new ideas and it lets me think about how I would approach what they're asking me. And this seems really relevant to what's going on in the world right now, especially in the US, is that one email I got was when I was regularly doing guest podcasts. I mostly see white people and white women on your show. What's up with that? And I was like, well, yeah, okay. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
Yeah.
took that in and I said, you are right. That is what is on my show. And I will just be honest and say that that is who I've been drawn to lately. And that was real and honest. And they were asking me to put more women and people of color on the show. And I said, I'm going to look at that and why that is. And part of what I realized was my circle of people in my professional world was constructed of a lot of white people, which is, I think, part of the pain that people have been speaking about. Where are all the people? There's so many people of diverse ethnicities and races in the US, and how come they're not in these sort of positions or roles? And so the people around me that that's just what I've been used to too, right? Growing up in Rochester, Michigan, I was one of like 3 Asians. That's grown since then, but it just kind of reflected what I was immersed in. And so it also brings up that question for me, what is the right thing? What is the aligned thing, rather, for me? I didn't want to just put people of color on just to fill a quota. That doesn't make sense. And I say that because I wouldn't want to be one of those people. But some people would, but I wouldn't. So I just had to stay with my own integrity that I would open to looking for more people or opening those doors in more ways, and yet just making sure that I do still resonate with that person that I want on my show if they are a person of color, and not just to fill my numbers. I don't have numbers. So I did get that feedback, and that was really important for me. So I think as a podcaster, it's really important to take feedback from all angles.
That is something that's on my mind too, is looking at whose voices am I sharing. And most of the people who are easy for me to have on my show, or who come to mind when I think of, oh, I'd like to talk to somebody about this or that, that's the easy thing. And I have seen in those Facebook groups and forums, I've seen people who say, well, I'd love to have more diverse people on my show, but I don't know where to look, or I don't know how. I understand feeling that way, but then also that's your job. Do the work to consider, why is it that you have no idea where to find somebody who's not white? Why is that? And it's not a criticism. I think that's one of the amazing things that's an opportunity for a podcaster, is that you don't have to stick with the people that you know. You now have a platform and an excuse to reach out to other people and to meet new people and to broaden your circle of whose voices might contribute to the conversation through your platform. And I think it is more work for sure, but it's a great opportunity being able to step outside of your circle in a way that feels aligned, even if it feels like more work, and even if it feels uncomfortable at times, and even if it feels awkward. And it's definitely something that I've been looking at a lot for myself. One thing that I've done towards that end is I've started seeking out more podcasts to listen to that would not be like the first one I would download, just because I might think, oh, this isn't intended for me. And so I think that it is an opportunity just to question that, why is it that we fall into the habits and the patterns that we're in? And then how do we authentically move beyond those habits and patterns? That was extremely long-winded. I didn't intend to get on a soapbox.
No, I think that you stated it beautifully. And as you're talking about that, it allowed me to reflect a little too on why it was hard in the beginning, or what did happen for me. And when I was a beginning podcaster, I mean, maybe I still am a beginning podcaster, but in my very beginnings, it was so scary to do interviews. It was way easier to do interviews with people I knew than to do it with somebody I had never met, and I just saw their name and a photo and an email or something from their marketing person. So I hear that in myself, that was part of the challenge, but it's layered with complexity, I think, for people, because then you throw in any discomfort you have about race that you may or may not know about. So that's, I think, the discomfort to lean into. You've got 2 discomforts, your own being out there. And second, any discomfort with someone who's different from you and what they may bring forward to the table, which can be so rich and lovely, or uncomfortable perhaps.
Yeah, that's 100% true. And I just wrote that down for myself as a podcast coach. In 5 years of producing podcasts, I have forgotten that interviews are scary. They were for me too in the beginning, and they're not anymore. But it's 5 years later.
Yeah.
A lot of podcasters are newer than that. And yeah, how do you support someone to have the confidence and the skills, because it's confidence and skills, to do a podcast with someone who you don't really know? It's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. Should we talk about it? How do we?
I mean, I think one of the things is just to do it, right? Like one of the things is just doing it.
Just to do it.
I mean, I always tell this story that my first few episodes, and by few, I don't really know how many I mean, but when I first started doing interview episodes, I would write down all of my questions on a list, and I would have that list. And I could not deviate from my list, not because I told myself you cannot deviate from your list, but because I was too nervous. I knew I was going to edit. I knew I was not on live radio. But I think part of it maybe is because I have a background in performing for theater when things are live and you can't miss a step. And, you do have a script that you're following and you do have blocking that you're following. And there's a certain pressure to get it right and to be responsive in the moment. And that was always one of the hardest things for me as a theater performer was improv. Being open to respond authentically in the moment without a script was terrifying for me. So I would listen back to my interviews and I would ask a question. Somebody gives a rich, wonderful, interesting answer. And instead of asking them more about that or following up on that question, I would say, okay, great, and move on to my next question.
Yeah.
And it was just because I was nervous.
I did something similar, although maybe even more embarrassing for myself. Maybe this is like my first 5 interviews. I was just hoping that I wouldn't have to do the talking. I would just bring up a subject. Okay, yoga. Go. Tell me. And they're like, well, what? What about it? And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't really say that, but that's kind of how I look back upon it. And fondly, like I'm kind of gentle with myself about it. I laugh about it. But I do remember just wanting to ask a question and hoping that I wouldn't have to do a conversation, that they would just share everything awesome that they would share. And then I would ask the next question and then they would do it again. And I realized that that's actually not the kind of podcast I wanted to have, but it was just all I could do, for that one podcast. And that my original intention, which I wanted to carry through, was to do that sort of vulnerable, alchemic, collaborative conversation that organically moves where it goes because 2 people are coming together and something magical could happen here if you're both in the edge of what is interesting to you both. That's not what everyone intends for their podcast, of course, but that's what I had the intention for. And I was like, wow, I'm really far from that when I just bring up a topic and hope they just talk about it.
Yes. And I think that those are the most compelling shows as a listener to experience are when that connection happens and when something new is created. When somebody is, especially if somebody is interviewed for, let's say, 10 podcasts, if they get asked the same questions and they give similar answers all 10 times, presumably maybe it's different people listening to all 10 podcasts, but it's missing something, it's losing something. But when there is a conversation that happens in the moment that will never be replicated and can never be, I'm just going to put us in that category, Candice. Right now, this conversation that you and I are having will never be replicated on another podcast.
It won't. It won't. I feel so in tune with you. Like I feel like we're in this bubble. I mean, I am literally in my sound bubble that I created, sound fort that I created for myself, but I feel like we're in it.
Yeah, and that it comes from that willingness and a trust relationship that you establish, and you don't have to know somebody for like a super long amount of time to build that trust relationship. There are other ways to do it. It's a few things. It's the practice, it's the willingness, it's the intention, it's the openness, and it's also being willing to just start and know that you don't need to be a master interviewer the first 5, 10, 20, however many episodes, that it's something that you have to be willing to take those first imperfect steps and grow as you do it, I think.
Absolutely. And the thing that I would just add to that in my own process is that I do things to ground my body during and before, and I just let things slow down. You don't have to respond right away to what someone says. And yeah, there may be a time lag on the internet. So there's that too.
I'm like, quite literally, we cannot respond immediately right now.
Yeah, we have to have pause time. But basic things like touching your body head to toe and just feeling the touch of your body. Some people like deep breathing, but sometimes deep breathing also triggers people in their nervous system. So just feeling a couple of breaths and noticing however those breaths are. And one thing I do is center my energy in my hips and my sacral area and just breathe right into there and imagine that I could speak right from there. If I'm nervous, if I'm feeling fine, then it's okay. I'm okay. But it has taken me a long time to feel okay. Even me, and I do a lot of embodied work. Interviews are just scary for me. And they can still be a little bit like, ooh, what's going to happen? But because I do so much healing work, I think what I see in myself is that over time that has improved greatly. Improved is the wrong word. I just feel more at home and at ease with myself and kind of just more okay with whatever happens. Like, okay, we can do something with whatever happens. And it's not about looking good as much as it was in the beginning, like the fear of looking good or being good. It's just, let's do this and let's interact and let's be here together.
That's so appropriate that you brought it back to the body-centered work, even though it's a conversation about podcasting. That is genius. That's podcasting genius.
Yay!
Candice, is there any other advice that you have for podcasters in terms of navigating their own content or thinking about their own show for being responsive in challenging times?
The first thing that comes to me is that it's really important, at least for me, to just check in with myself about how I'm experiencing whatever it is that is happening out there. And what's happening in me is really key because it's going to inform how I podcast and from which place of myself I'm going to podcast from. Something that I struggle with is seeing what people are posting on social media and in their podcasting and getting swept in the tide in things like this, where it's a big, intense event that is, I mean, literally sweeping the world, which is fascinating. But maybe it's who I follow, I don't know, but there's a wave of content, and I don't always fit with what people are saying for my life, for me. And yet I see the value of what all sorts of people are saying. I think it's really important to know or to remember that there's such a complexity of where everybody's coming from. Everyone's on a different leg and in a different place of their journey in life, their growth, whatever they've chosen to do in this life or at this time, whatever awareness level they have, whatever embodiment level they have, whatever energetic vibration they're on. And even the words that we say might come with a different energetic component underneath it. So remembering all that, I'm able to then see all that, take a pulse, gather information, and also learn, but then sit back into myself, let it digest, and really see what wants to come through me. And that's just so important to me to feel integrity and aligned and clear with what I want to share from the original and daily intention of podcasting, why I'm podcasting in general. So I just recommend connecting with yourself before you write whatever you're going to write, if you do a script, or before you start podcasting, or do it and see what happens, and then see if you like it and see what you want to do with it after. I mean, I've recorded a handful of podcasts and scrapped them around this time. I recorded it. It just needed to come out. And then it's like, well, that doesn't need to go out publicly. That's just not what I want to put out publicly right now. So practice. Just let it be whatever comes out but check it and see if it's authentic to you, what you personally want to share in the world and what you're here to create and offer.
Is there anything else that you want to share with Podcast Envy listeners today before we say goodbye?
I think just if you have that inspiration to podcast or a certain podcast in a certain way or a certain inspiration you have for your podcast, go for it. Like, break the rules, do it your way. We need people to break the structures that have been and to come into our own selves and to show up in the world from the place of loving ourselves. And if podcasting is your way, go for it. Start wherever you are and take one step and stand behind yourself. Have a little faith, stand behind yourself with whatever you choose to do and just do it.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.